In this video, we're going to continue with our form examples, and what we're going to do is add a search form to our people database that we worked with before. Let's go ahead and take a look at it in action so you know what we're talking about here. So in the third folder, which is called Forms and Sessions in the resource pack, go ahead and open up the third step, which is called Adding Search Form and Ternary Operator. Go ahead and copy all the code and paste it over the code that's currently in your test.php file and save it. Okay, let's go ahead and jump to the browser and refresh our test.php file. Now here we have an example that you've seen before for the most part. We have several records of people with different pieces of data about each person. The difference with this example is that we also have this form called search phrase. And if we enter something like Sally in this form and hit enter, you'll see that we filter out the people that display in this table. Now we only see Sally. If we went ahead and did a search for beach and hit enter, you'd see we only see Deepak here, whose favorite band is Beach Boys. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the code and see what we did to adjust our previous example to enable this filtering. Now there's a lot of practical uses for being able to add search to a database of some kind or a display of some kind, and there are lots of different ways to go about it. In this one, we're just exploring one approach. Let's go ahead and take a look at the source code. I'm going to jump back to the editor and scroll up to the top. Now again, like we have in previous examples, we're going to read through this file just like PHP would, skipping what we don't need until we actually do need it. Okay, so at the top we have our opening PHP tag, and then we have a definition of a function called parse data file. Now we know from our previous examples that what this does is take some data from a text file and it converts it into an array. We're not running this function yet, so we'll go ahead and skip it. And this next function is called output as table. Now again, from our previous example, this function takes care of taking an array and rendering it as a table with labels across the top. Now the only difference between this function here and our previous example is that it now takes a second parameter called search phrase, which we'll get to in a moment when this function is actually called. Let's go ahead and skip this function since it's not actually being run yet. Now this first line that actually runs will look a little bit foreign at first, because it's using something called a ternary operator. A ternary operator is an alternative syntax for a simple if statement, where we're checking to see the value of a particular variable, and then we're setting another variable based on whether it is or isn't that value. If we scroll up into this function, there's a more clear example of how this works, and we'll come back to where this happens in the function in a bit, but the implementation is very similar. So we have our ternary operator here, but here are a couple of other ways that we can write this that will look more familiar to you. In this first version, we're using an if statement, and we're checking to see if a variable called search phrase is empty. If it is, then we're setting a new variable called search match to true. But if it's not, and we're using else in order to indicate that, then we're going to set search match to false. So this code takes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines in order to run. Let's go ahead and take a look at a slightly shorter version of the same thing that you'll also recognize. In this version, what we're doing is setting the default first, and then we're just checking for one condition instead of checking whether the condition exists and then whether the condition doesn't exist. So we're assuming here in this first line that the condition does not exist. So we're setting search match to false. You see that we have search match false here. And then we do the same if statement here. If the search phrase is empty, then we're going to set search match to true. And so this will override the initial value of this variable. So this version of the code takes 1, 2, 3, 4 lines. So a ternary operator is simply an alternative syntax that uses only a single line. And here's how it's structured. The idea, again, is that we're setting the value of this variable based on whether a condition is true or false, or a variable is true or false. So on the left side of this operation, we have the variable that we're going to set, and then we use an equal sign. This variable and equal sign isn't part of the ternary operator. The ternary operator is actually what's to the right of that. So occasionally you'll see a ternary operator by itself, but the most common use will assign the return value from the ternary operator to a variable of some kind. The right side of the equal sign will have 3 parts to it. The first is the condition, the second is the value if the condition is true, and the third is the value if the condition is false. So in this case, we're checking to see if the search phrase is not empty. So in the context of our example, this is if somebody entered something into that form. So if it isn't empty, we're going to set search match to false, And if it is empty, we're going to set the value of search match to true. Now, the reason why we're doing this will become more clear as we jump back into this function as it gets called. But for now, I wanted to hop up here so we could take a look at these alternative ways to write the same thing.